மறக்காம சர்ப்ரைஸ் பண்ணுங்க. தேங்க்யூ.
To begin my section on pawn endgames, we'll see an example that shows that even the apparently most simple endgames have many tricks and mysteries in them and have to be treated with respect. This was my game where I had the white pieces against Grandmaster Dennis Wagner in a tournament that took place in Zalakáros, Hungary, 2015. I've been defending the ending with queen and 2 pawns against queen and 3 pawns on one side of the board for a number of moves. And this ending, of course, should be drawn from the start, but I played it pretty badly and this position was reached now. I've allowed the black king to reach h4 and basically haven't managed to create any kind of perpetual check or anything like that. So here he now played queen e2, and this move threatens f3. If I take on f3, the queens will be traded and he'll take the h-pawn, and then he will win easily in the king and pawn ending. And otherwise, after f3, if my king moves, he will get the f-pawn. So for instance, king g1, he'll have a check on e1 followed by taking f2. So this is a deadly threat, and it was basically not possible to stop it. Both players now were playing on the increment. Essentially, we had very low time. It's move 80. The game has been very long, and So I set a trap with queen takes g6, played the most practical chance, I think. First of all, it's a trap, although it was pretty transparent, but mainly it forces a king and pawn ending. And I wasn't sure if it was a draw or if I'm losing, but there was no time to calculate it. I simply had to take the chance, and the alternatives were bad anyway, so it was not a difficult decision. In order to stop f3, it's very difficult, of course. The only way to do it is queen a4, which would pin the f-pawn. But then comes g5, and white can't hold this defensive position. He has to keep the f-pawn pinned constantly. Also has to watch that the black queen doesn't appear on the long diagonal, which would allow black to then invade with the queen to f3, or to force white to play f3, in which case the queen would return to e2, driving the white king back, and the black king would invade and take the h-pawn. Also, there are possibilities at the right moment of attacking the h-pawn. White has to be ready to guard it against queen attacking it from this diagonal. And with all of these things, it's impossible to defend. So for instance, queen to d4. Now black can play queen to c2, and eventually he puts white in a position where he can't guard everything, so the threat is queen c6 now. And then queen d5. Now f3 wasn't threatened anymore, but then comes queen c3, and now f3 is once again possible, and also the h-pawn is under attack. So white can't defend both of those. If queen e6, f3 check, and black will inevitably win. So I played queen takes g6. Now came f3, king h1. This was the point. I don't want to allow my f-pawn to be taken with check. And now black has to obviously be careful here. And he played queen f1, so not falling for the trap. Queen takes f2 is a very obvious stalemate trap. You watch carefully when your king is put into such a position, when your opponent's king is put into such a position, because stalemate becomes possible. But white has to be careful how he carries it out. So the obvious queen g5 doesn't work, because after king takes h4, black can take with the queen, and it's not stalemate. Instead, white has queen g5 f6 check, and then if the pawn is captured, white will have queen f5 check, or if king g3, then there would be queen g5 check, forcing the pawn to be captured. So king h3, queen f5 check, and then queen g4, wherever the black king goes, and then stalemate is forced. But there was no chance he was going to fall in for this, even with time pressure. This is too obvious. So he played queen f1, and I have to block. I can't allow my f pawn to be taken with check, of course. Now queen h3 check. It doesn't matter if he trades queens and takes the pawn, or if he does this, it's reaching the same position. Play queen h2. And now queen takes h2. Again, he can move his king, but after I move my king, he needs to eventually trade queens. So in any case, the same position will always be reached. King takes king g4, king g1. So now he repeated moves a couple of times. That's fine, of course, and a good strategy. He gained a little bit of thinking time with the increment adding up on each move. King f4, king h2, king g4, king g1. And here he played king f4. Of course, he can't go through the king side with king h3. If this whole position were moved to the left one file, then of course it's absolutely no question at all. It's very easily winning. The king would just go around to the right, to the I file, so to speak, if it existed. King h1, h4 would force white's king back to g1, and then king would go to i2. But that file doesn't exist, so after king h1, there's just no way through on the king side. He can advance the pawn as well, but it's not going anywhere. I just stay with my king on g1 and h1, and there's no progress possible. So he returned to f4. I went king h2. This was now the second repetition, so this was the deciding point where he had to find a way to make progress. And clearly, the king has to go around somehow in this way in order to win the game, while I'm being diverted by the h-pawn. But with very little time on the clock, he couldn't find the solution, which wasn't so easy, and he played h4, which was definitely not a move he wanted to play, but he simply couldn't find a way to make to avoid the repetition. Now the h-pawn is closer to my king, and so I'll take it more quickly, and he won't be able to bring his king around to e2 in time. Let's see how he could have won. First of all, the obvious move is king e4, but then I play king g3. And now the problem is black wishes it were white's move in this position. White wants it to be black's move, and that's what it is in this position now. He has to give way. If it were white's move, I would have to move my king away, and he would be able to continue with his journey, king to d3 and then king e2. But it is his move, so if he goes king d3, of course I just take his pawn. So the only try then is to play h4 to divert my king, but he's not in time now. I take king d3, and now becomes a very important type of position to know for beginning chess players. Basic kind of king and pawn ending idea and a type of position which could occur anywhere, of course, on the board, any files or ranks. This is known as the trebuchet, which is a medieval slingshot kind of weapon. But in chess, it's this kind of this method in a pawn endgame where these two pawns are facing each other, blocked, and neither side wants to be the first to approach. So here, if king g3 would be a terrible blunder, because after king e2, now it's a mutual zugzwang. The white king has to give way. Black will take the pawn on f2 and win. Meanwhile, if it was black's move here, then it would be the same. His king would have to give way, and white would take the f3 pawn and win. So how to arrange that? Well, white has the possibility to do it in this position because he plays king g4, not king g3, but king g4 in order to lose a tempo. Therefore, I attack his pawn on f3. If he persists in trying to win by king e2, then I play king g3 and white wins. So his king moves, king takes f3, and his king is not in front of my pawn. So I will promote it. So in this position, though, still he has a chance, the last chance to turn back from his path and still to make a draw. He should go king e4, and then I'll win his pawn on f3, but his king will get in front of my pawn, so it'll be a draw anyway. King g3, king e5, king f3, king f5 with a drawn endgame. So this clearly shows that king e4, at this point, these two squares, king e4 and g3, are what are known as related squares. Neither side wants to be the first to occupy them. And all the maneuvers will be to try to force the opponent to occupy one of them first. So king e4 doesn't work. Of course, king g4, I return my king to g1, and the game is drawn by repetition. So next we can try king f5, trying to be more subtle. If white king goes to g3, occupying the related square, then king e4, and now it's white's turn. So this kind of triangulation would force white's king to give way, and then black would win. King would get to e2 after white's king moves. But the problem is white doesn't have to occupy g3, and he can also dance around the square with king h3. So I avoid occupying g3, and I'm ready now, if king e4, only then to occupy g3 with the position we already saw. Meanwhile, if the king returns to f4, then my king just goes back to h2, again with a repetition. So how is black to make progress here? Well, it turns out there is a way. He has to go king e5. This move not only avoids the e4 square, avoids this related square, but also prepares to send the king around this way while avoiding this mined square. Black will only occupy e4 once white's king goes to g3. So here, of course, if king g3, king e4, and now it's white's turn, and so this position is winning for black. To show further, if the king tries to stay passive, the black king reaches down to e2. White's able to defend f2, but then comes a tempo move h4 or even king e1. Doesn't matter, and the white king has to relinquish the f2 pawn, and black wins. Or, if white goes after the h pawn, we'll see that black is faster. And next, black takes the f pawn, and then his f pawn will queen. So, king g3, king e4 wins. Meanwhile, if white goes king h3, trying to do as after king f5, to avoid the g3 square, but be ready to occupy it if black king goes to e4, then the king goes to d4, again planning to go around to d3 and then to e2. And once again, if king g3, black goes back to e4, and it's white's turn. And white has been forced to occupy the related square first. Meanwhile, if white goes after the h pawn, he's still too slow. King h4, king d3, king h5, king e2, king g4, king f2, and black goes then king e2 and f2, f1 and wins. So this shows that with king e5, black was winning. But it's not absolutely simple. I'm sure my opponent would find it with no problem at all if he had a few more minutes. But or even that maybe he would have found it in most cases. But at this point in this game, he wasn't able to find it with very little time. Of course, one is also quite nervous when you're low on time and tired after playing 90 moves at this point. So he played h4. Now the game is drawn because his h-pawn is too close to my king. Whenever he tries to move his king around, I take his h-pawn. So I play king h3, planning to take his pawn. King g5, king h2, king g4, king g1. There's no way possible through on the king side of either king h3. I just move my king back and forth, or h3. I go king h2 and also move my king back and forth. He went back to f5, king h2, and now he went to f4. If he tried again to go around king e4, he's too slow because the h-pawn is close, or king h3, king d3, king h4. And now, again, we have the position similar to what we saw before. If king e2, king g3, with a trebuchet, black loses. If he tries again to persist in trying to win with king d2, then I'm able to use this tempo maneuver, king g3, g4, forcing him to protect the pawn, and then king g3. And once again, black loses. Meanwhile, if instead he should, once again, he should turn back from this course and make a draw with drawn endgame. Instead, he played king f4, and the game finished up with just some more repetitions of moves, which because there's no possibility for black to do anything, and then the game was drawn at this point. So, two things to learn here, very important. First of all, even the most basic king and pawn endings, the most basic endings, can be tricky. The endgame is one of the most mysterious parts of chess, and every mistake counts for more in the ending than in the middle game, which is what makes relatively simple positions so intricate. The other thing is that sometimes I see amateur players having this idea that masters or grandmasters have memorized every single possible permutation of basic endgames. In other words, memorized all of, let's say, Rubin Fine's basic chess endgames, or just memorize the table base. This would be absurd. This would be a pointless endeavor and probably impossible for most people as well. Nobody's memorized all of every possible basic endgame, but it's crucial to know the basic principles, to understand the play, and then you can calculate these things very quickly. Here my opponent didn't have enough time, of course, but generally speaking, knowing the principles, it would be easy to calculate these endings. But okay, if he knew exactly this exact position, which would be impossible for anyone to know every exact possible endgame position, he would win, of course. But this is player nearly 2600, and he doesn't have a table base in his brain, and nobody does. So this is important. You don't need to memorize every basic endgame, you just need to know the ideas.
மறக்காம சர்ப்ரைஸ் பண்ணுங்க. Thank you.